My mother is Hugh Linehan, the well-known actor. Yeah. My father, Fergus, was a journalist, arts editor of the Irish Times for many years, but also wrote plenty of comic material, mostly for herself and Des Keogh, on radio and occasionally on TV, and a lot on stage. Lots of reviews down the years, and in more recent years, as in the last 20 years or so, I suppose, my mother is probably better known as a quote unquote serious actor.
And she was a comic actor, of course, back in the 60s and 70s.
Yes.
Is it? Yeah.
She went over to the dark side.
Yeah.
She started doing Chekhov and Tom Murphy and all kinds of things, Brian Friel and so on and so forth. Although I think she will always still say that comedy is harder work.
Sure. And your dad, Hugh, he was arts editor of the Irish Times?
Yes, my dad was film critic at one point, and I ended up being a film critic in the Irish Times at one point as well. And he was arts editor in the Irish Times too. I'm not sure how to put this. I hope they're not watching. I think they're in London. He's more self-effacing than my mother, and lots of people weren't aware that he was writing all this material for her down the years. In fact, when I was growing up, I think half the people thought that my father was Des Keogh, which of course would be everybody's dream to have their father being Des Keogh, but he isn't. Sure. At least not as far as I know.
And your brothers, Hugh, but both of them are in the arts as well?
Yes, Conor is a musician, a pianist, does a lot of work in theatre, in the Abbey and the Gate, as well as being a concert pianist and a classical pianist and teaches. Sure. And Fergus was director of the theatre festival, the Dublin Theatre Festival for many years, and then went on to be director of the Sydney Arts Festival for several years, and is now, I suppose he's a kind of cultural impresario. He describes himself as a truffle hunter for cultural artifacts. He has the very difficult job of travelling around the world, finding interesting new theatre companies and hooking them up with arts festivals around the world.
Wow.
And my sister is the only member of the family with a proper job. She's a teacher.
Fantastic.
Ivana, yeah.
And the family from Blackrock, Hugh,
yes.
And you went to New Park.
I went to New Park, indeed, yes. A very
different,
very rigorous, highly religious school. We all had to wear uniforms all the time. I'm sure you all know about New Park.
But in interesting times. So that was in the 70s, is that?
Yes, yes, there were lots of flares until punk rock arrived, of course.
Yeah, and you were a punk rocker, I believe. Is that true?
My life was changed when I heard Anarchy in the UK for the first time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the other cultural references at the time, Hugh, or what was?
Well, you know, there's a lot
punk rock was obviously huge, and that sort of transformed a lot of people. But
yeah, definitely. I think I come from a family of readers, so I mean, definitely influenced by fiction. The influence of cinema was very strong on me. When I was growing up, my father was a director of the old Irish Film Theatre. I'm not sure if you remember it. It's where the Sugar Club is now. Sure. And it was the only place, I think, really, where art house cinema was shown in Dublin at the time. So I have memory of being brought along at an inappropriate age to watch very disturbing Fassbender films and things like that. So that obviously left a scar on my psyche. The one thing I didn't end up liking was the theatre. I just have memories as a child of being brought to first nights, and I still have a phobia about first nights. I'll happily go to plays at times, but I think first nights they're always the worst time to see a play, and then you've got to tell everybody they were wonderful afterwards, and it's, you know, I prefer to go to a second night.
Sure. And Irish society at the time, Hugh, I mean, before we get into the Irish Times and more serious topics, but I mean, Irish culture at the time was going through a difficult time. Irish society was going through a difficult time.
When is it not?
Yeah, good question. I tried this on you before and you came with the same answer.
Yeah, I'm a citizen of the Republic of Dunleary, which is in many ways quite different from the rest of Ireland, in that, unlike lots of other people my age, I had little or no experiences, negative or otherwise, of interaction with the Catholic Church and some of the forms which have been revealed to us in recent years. So I couldn't really say that I have the very strong feelings, which you still see represented very strongly in the media, for example, and in cultural circles. And I know you've talked to Mannix Flynn about his experiences. It could hardly be more removed from my comfortable middle-class experiences in South Dublin in the 1970s. I suppose because I was, my parents would tell you, a rather difficult young teenager, I would have taken a bit against the sort of liberal consensus, which would have been pretty common in New Park at the time. Not to swing to the extreme right or anything like that, but a sort of a general acceptance that, you know, everything would be nice if everybody was progressive and liberal and was tolerant of everybody.
And then before you went to Trinity, so we're in the late 70s
early 80s now.
Early 80s. So at that time in California, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were fighting it out. We didn't know much about that here at the time.
I knew nothing about it.
No one knew anything about it.
No, nothing. No, nothing at all. I think my cultural reference points would have been music and cinema and literature at that point. I don't think I saw an Apple Mac till the second half of the 80s.
Yeah.
You know.
If you had to choose at the time, or if you I mean, I know obviously lots happened since then, and we'll go on to that in a few moments. But
I sense a difficult question coming.
Steve Jobs or Bill Gates?
The obvious answer is Steve Jobs. I do have a kind of a concern about the control freakery of Steve Jobs. Of course, it ends up, being the outcome of it is these fantastic artifacts, which I'm very, very fond of. I have one of them in my pocket and another one in my bag behind the scene. But sure. I am also slightly drawn to the kind of the philosophy of the open web, if you like, which the Apple concept is kind of antithetical to. Apple is all about the walled garden, we'll design it all and serve your every need. And the idea of the open web and of sharing information in a much more open way is also attractive. But mind you, Bill Gates isn't very big on that either, is it? So it's a kind of a Hobson's choice here, so we'll go for Joe. Sure. Because he makes nicer things. Before we
go there, I have an information technology question. For the audience, and it might be a nice time before we go into that. But so this is going to be an audience participation, an audience question, and the prize is 1 year's subscription to irishtimes.com. So you'll go straight into Hugh's world. But this was talking about information technology, and I want you to tell me who said this. And what were they talking about? What information technology were they talking about? This invention of yours will create forgetfulness in their souls because they will not use their memories. Who said that about an information technology? This invention of yours will create forgetfulness in their souls because they will not use their memories. It was a long time ago. It was a long time ago.
He came from a country that is in the news a lot these days.
He came from a country that's in the news. Well, maybe no one's going to win the prize, and I'm afraid we're going to have to. But it was Plato said it, and he was talking about a new information technology at the time called the Greek alphabet. And his great concern was that people would move from the spoken word to the written word. And what he was afraid of was, in conversation with Socrates, I think at the time, he was afraid that this information technology would have a very dampening impact. But here's someone who felt the fear and did it anyway, and of information technology. And from Trinity, you went into the film business?
Yeah, after faffing around for a bit, as people do sometimes in their early 20s in America and a few other places. Yeah, I came back and started working in freelance film production as an assistant director and a location manager, which was a great education, actually, in the world of media and cultural creativity. And there was an interesting sort of ferment at the time because the film board had just been shut down. It was that post-1987 kind of period. But ironically, if people who are old enough to remember, that was the point in time when Neil Jordan and Jim Sheridan started having their great successes, and a lot of very interesting films were made. And I was lucky enough to work on films such as The Dead and The Commitments and Into the West. And I ended up, despite myself, it was nothing to do with me, but quite a good CV there.
Okay. But had you been involved in journalism before that, Hugh? Or?
Nope, not at all.
And then how did the Irish Times come about?
Arising out of my interest in film production, I started getting involved in making no-budget short films, essentially, and through that I became involved with Filmbase, which is an organisation located next to the IFI, which is a resource for independent filmmakers. Through that, I started writing for their magazine, which became known as Film Ireland. And through that, I ended up becoming editor of Film Ireland. And as I was editor of Film Ireland, Michael Dwyer, who was then the film critic of the Irish Times, much lamented, unfortunately died a couple of years ago, a good friend, asked me to start contributing to the film comms of the Irish Times. So that's sort of how it came about. I gradually migrated from one world into another.
The Irish Times is driven by quite a strong ethos and value system. I mean, if you go onto irishtimes.com, you can get to the Articles of Association, and they talk about its role as a serious newspaper and about its ethos. Was that something that influenced you? I mean, obviously coming from your dad and the family, but from a journalistic point of view.
Well, I think anybody starting out in something like journalism is going to go wherever the work takes them, first of all. But I think I'm going to choose my words carefully here, because the Irish Times is sometimes accused of arrogance or smugness. But I do honestly think that any serious journalist looking to work in Ireland, the Irish Times would be their first port of call. Sure. if they had the choice. That's absolutely true. I think it stands for the best standards possible. That doesn't mean it always achieves them, but I think it makes a very honest effort to try and achieve them. Yes, you're right. The Irish Times was part of my life. It came into, I was reading it for as long as I can remember, going back as long as I can remember. So it was a sort of there was a natural thing there anyway. And I certainly feel, and I've always felt, very comfortable within it. It's a very civilized institution. It still, I believe, treats its employees very well, and that forms part of its ethos too. And I think that the principles which it stands for are as important today as when those articles of association were first written.
Yeah, and those principles, I mean, I get a sense that certainly with a lot of what Kevin O'Sullivan is talking about at the moment, that the Irish Times is trying to make sure that where it locates in the digital world is driven by that value system. Is that a fair comment?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I don't think that anything that's happening in the technological disruption which we're seeing in our industry at the moment invalidates any of those principles at all. In fact, it possibly strengthens them. Something it certainly does force us to do is to examine them more closely than perhaps we might do otherwise, that we have to look at them rather than take them for granted, because we are faced, and there is no doubt about this, because we are faced, if you like, with an existential threat to our further existence. It does force one to go back to basics and ask those sort of questions about who we are, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we can continue doing it.
Yeah. And at the same time, I think Kevin was talking recently at the Media Futures Conference, and he said that digital is at the core of the Irish Times.
Yes.
He talked about the new content management system and about the comments and moderating system that's very close to your heart. Could you talk to us about that?
Well, as Kevin said at that conference, which was a couple of weeks ago, he is very committed to a concept of the Irish Times as a multimedia organisation, as opposed to being, let's say, a newspaper with some digital stuff on the side. And that's a really fundamental change for us in the newspaper and the way we do our work and the way we're going to do it into the future. Because while the Irish Times was a groundbreaker, in that it was one of the first newspapers in these islands to go online in 1996, it's time for it to make a leap now and to stop just being a newspaper that puts its content online with some other things like breaking news and blogs, and to start from every day to be thinking as much digitally as it does in terms of print. And the new content management system, which you referred to, is very integral to that. We're working very intensively over the last 2 weeks or so with the providers in terms of defining how we're going to change our work in the Irish Times, but always in terms of what it means in terms of output and what it means for our audience. And increasingly we talk about our audience rather than our readers.
Okay. So new content management system is absolutely key to what you're doing, and that facilitates the comments and moderating system.
Well, those two things are slightly different, and it's, we have other developments going on all the time. We have Johnny Ryan in as our sort of innovation officer at the moment, and Johnny is always coming up with good thoughts, some of which work and some of which don't, and that's exactly the way it should be, because in this new world you have to be prepared to try things which will fail and move on and try more things and try again, and Johnny has a role there too. But it's undoubtedly true that what the management system will allow us to do is to take full advantage of the way in which the web can allow you to group stuff according to metadata, to weave multimedia into text, to marry the two together, to tell stories in new ways, in interactive ways, use data in terms of interactive graphics, and allow people to kind of engage with our content a whole new kind of
And that's on the technical side, because I think at the same conference, I don't know whether it was Kevin or maybe you were talking about, from an Irish Times point of view, the idea that information is cheap, leading to white noise. People need insight they can trust, and thus the Irish Times, which to me seems to be the sort of the qualitative side of the technical side of what's happening.
Yeah, and I think that was Kevin, and he's absolutely right. I mean, what's happening is one of the things that I'm glad he said is that people talk sometimes slightly derisively about the Irish Times as being the newspaper of record.
Sure.
Now, the era of the newspaper of record is over. You know, there are certain things that as a newspaper we used to do that in my view, there is no need for us to do them anymore. When the Anglo-Irish Agreement was, published, we'd print the full agreement. When somebody made a very long speech, we'd publish the full speech. Now, the reality is that all that kind of information, call it data, call it whatever you want, is now freely available on the web. The value that we can bring to that kind of information is context, analysis, depth, and now also providing a platform for debate around that as well.
Okay.
And that's what we'd be looking to do.
And it seems, I mean, maybe I'm trying to ask leading questions, but it's trying to bring together both a responsiveness to the technical side of the digital world with the core values of the newspaper. I mean, if you go back, if you look at the articles of association of the Irish Times, which are written on the website, and it talks about an independent newspaper primarily concerned with serious issues for both the benefit of the community. It goes on to talk about an editorial policy that supports constitutional democracy, the progressive achievements of social justice, etc., etc. Now, they were valid in the 1950s, they were valid in the 1960s, and they're equally valid now. But they seem to sit quite comfortably, or it seems to me that there's sort of a coming together of that that sort of creative side and the technical side back into the core values.
Yes, and it's impossible to, and it would be a mistake to try and put a divide between the two. Those principles are very important. There's a couple more there which I think are particularly important, which you didn't mention there, which are about making sure that minority voices are recognised and are reflected. And there's a cultural remit, which in my view is also very important as well. But what's happening at the moment, and I know we're going to go on and talk a little bit more about technological disruption, is that, if you like, the world of journalism, which is rooted in the humanities and the idea of storytelling and creating a story and a narrative arc and so on and so forth, and that's what an article is coming to grips with the world of technology, which is really derived more out of concepts originally of mathematics and engineering and so on and so forth. But data is data, and you can actually tell all kinds of stories either using data tools like graphics and so on and so forth, or you can bring this data in and you can say, you mentioned white noise earlier, or Kevin mentioned white noise. In this fog of information, with this blizzard of data coming at us all the time, our job is to make sense out of it. So are there new ways in which you can make sense out of data? Well, is there a way in which you can make sense out of what has happened to this country over the last 5 or 6 years? Is there lurking within the data, the financial data, the government records, if you can get access to them, which is a problem sometimes, in the data about the behaviour of population? Can you actually find new ways to tell stories that make sense, that explain to people why we are where we are right now, and perhaps what kind of decisions we might make to get to wherever it is we want to go in the future?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it certainly impresses me hugely, and I mean, it's the feeling I get that there's a genuine commitment in the Irish Times around what you're talking about. It seems to be missing in a lot of the other media entities. I mean, we'll come on, as I say, and talk specifically about what's happening in the digital world, but it seems to me, and maybe it's unfair to ask you, but in some of the other media organisations, obviously independent newspapers comes to mind, that they're finding it incredibly difficult to find that kind of a driving ethos, because maybe because of a lack of core values, or maybe an underinvestment in technology, or a lack of understanding, or...
I'd be very hesitant to comment on the independent's core values. I'm sure, I know there are lots of people there who have very strong core values as well. I think, personally, the organisation itself, looking at it from the outside, has been sort of frozen because of the great sort of battle of wills which has been happening there over the last couple of years. Sure. And it's had difficulties with that. The Irish Independent is still the most popular broadsheet newspaper in the country in terms of its circulation, and from a business perspective in the Irish Times we have to recognise that, respect it and deal with Sure. it on a day-to-day basis. And the other problem it has, and God knows we all have our problems in the newspaper business at the moment, the other problem the Independent has is more similar to what you'd see in America a lot, which is that it was over-leveraged, that it was a viable, successful business, and too much money was taken out of it, and now in the hard times, it's finding it very difficult to make ends meet.
Sure.
That's my business idiot's analysis of business
it seems reasonable. It also seems very aligned. When we were talking recently, you referred to Tim Wu's book, The Rise and Fall of Information Empires. And that's getting a lot of notoriety at the moment. And as I understand it, what Tim Wu was trying to get to is that he is suggesting that the internet is going through that kind of or that all information technology, whether it was the alphabet and what maybe happened politically at that stage, but if you take information technology in the 20th century, that they go through this inevitable cycle from great invention, great excitement, open to closed to the controlling, and ultimately to the corporate dominance or state dominance.
Or a new hegemony, I think is really what he suggests. For anybody who hasn't read it, and it's well worth reading, he looks at other information technologies, mostly from the late 19th and early 20th century, like the telephone, radio, television, looks at their initial emergence, what happened to them over the first few years, and how they ended up when they kind of achieved the kind of broad penetration of society. Sure. And when he looks at them, he suggests that there are different phases, and among those phases are, first of all, the thing, whatever that thing may be, is invented, and there's great excitement among a tiny number of people because they can see it's going to change the world, but most people can't see it. And then there is a period of adoption when it spreads out into society, and piracy, when everybody is using it, but there's no laws around it all, and people are frantically trying to claim royalties and copyright, and it all ends up in court, and there's talk of piracy of various forms or another. And then there's a period of settling. And what he argues is that the state has a role to play in that. And these are all American examples he's looking at, by the way. We don't normally think of the state as having such an interventionist role in the US. But he argues that in each case, the state, by virtue of setting laws or antitrust laws or various other things, is complicit in setting up a new power structure, which in the case of the telephone system in the States ended up the setting up of AT&T, which in the case of broadcasting ended up with the big channels, the CBS, NBC, and ABCs. And he argues that there is a sort of a natural transition that takes place. And he looks at whether this is going to work in... That sounds nice. He looks at whether this is going to happen with the internet. Now, it should be said that he is a polemicist for the free and open web himself, and is very much a protagonist on behalf of Google. But it's a very interesting analysis, because if you look at what's happened with online over the last 20 years, you can see those phases, and you can ask yourself, where are we now in that cycle? Because they're all recognizable: the early adoption, the excitement, then spreading out, then the period of complete disruption, the accusations of piracy, everything ending up in court, which is kind of where we are at the moment.
Which he says that's exactly where we are at the moment.
Yes.
I mean, he talks about, I think him or one of his friends being in a room with senior executives from Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon, and all five of them were being sued or suing each other.
Yes.
And that's actually what's happening at the moment. Where do you see we are in that cycle at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a bit like, if anybody knows the history of the movie industry, all these people went off to California, actually, which is where all the Silicon Valley people are now, but they're in Northern California. But a bunch of people went off to Southern California and set up Hollywood because of the patent laws in New York, and we're just around that kind of point, I think. I think you are going to see new legal structures emerge. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is going to be shut down and the internet as we know it is going to be shut down. To me, that doesn't seem to be realistic, but or indeed desirable. But you can see there are moves towards, SOPA in the States and various other regulatory forums. There's debate in Europe about what sort of regulation should be around. And frankly, even though my instincts are libertarian, as I said earlier, I do believe in the open web and the benefits that it brings to society. There are certain issues around where, for example, we in the newspaper industry are, relatively tightly regulated in terms of what we are or are not allowed to do, and are subject to, various types of legislation which have emerged over the years, and rightly so. But is that the same case when it comes to people who are producing content and perhaps competing with us online? No, it's not. So there's a sort of a disjunction between, frankly, an archaic regulatory framework which applies to something called broadcasting and then applies to something called print media, and up to now barely applies to internet businesses at all. Whereas actually the distinction between broadcast and print media is blurring every day, and I think is going to become completely irrelevant over the next 10 years or so. And where do internet-only operations fit within all that? So there's a major debate to be had about that, and undoubtedly the state and the regulatory framework has some role to play in it. So while I have a sympathy for the open web, I don't hold with the ultimate libertarian rule position, which is that there should be no laws or no regulations.
Sure. But then if we go back to my Plato thought at the outset, and if we sort of can agree that a lot of the laws, the intellectual property laws, are obsolete, they can't deal with where we are at the moment.
That's certainly my view. Yeah.
You know, the patent wars, therefore, are just becoming sort of an outcome of that. That what it does open the door for sort of corporate dominance, and that's what has happened historically.
Well, certainly, and we can see it coming if it's not here already. Excuse me. I mean, it's one thing to say that everybody should be free to do whatever they want on the internet, but who are the people who's actually benefiting the most from the current structures? Well, it is the new great powers, and you mentioned them earlier. It's Google, it's Amazon, it's Facebook, it's Apple, and it does come back to some principles as well about us being a small open economy and a small country, and for example, from an Irish Times perspective, us being a small independent media company,
which is incredibly difficult. And two huge dynamics then coming out of that, and one is that each one is trying to create their own walled garden, and we can debate in a moment as to who's more likely to, whether it's coming from software dominance or through commercial dominance. But I mean, that seems to be going on at the moment. They're all building their walled gardens and they're trying to bring us into that garden.
Well, I think actually each one wants to be the internet.
Yes.
I mean, I think what Facebook wants to be is it wants to be the internet for the majority of the population. And in a way, that's what Apple wants to do as well for at least a segment of the population. Whether they succeed is another matter.
And one of the other big dynamics in that, and obviously a huge dynamic for the newspaper industry, which we'll come on and talk about in a couple of moments, is where are the toll booths, where are the charging booths as you go through that? Because they almost, a lot of those big companies almost have a vested interest not to go along with the protocols of charging, because they want to create their own charging mechanism, which makes it very, very difficult for whole sectors like the newspaper industry, or particular newspapers like the Irish Times, to be commercially viable in that new world.
Well, the issue of paying for content is a complex one. It's the newspapers have gone through swings and roundabouts on this over the last 10 or 15 years. The Irish Times itself has done so. It was free for the first 6 years of its existence. It went behind a paywall for 6 years, and for the last 4 years or so, it's been free again. I speak about the website. We have certain services that we charge for through Kindle and the e-paper and so on and so forth. But what's the best model, and how do we persuade people that it's the best model? The second part of that question is the most important one. A lot of journalists and people in the content creation industry, if you like, say things like, people should pay for content. It costs money to create content, so therefore people should pay for content. And on the face of it, that sounds like a very reasonable proposition. The difficulty is that it's a philosophical proposition rather than a business proposition. People will pay for content would be a business proposition. People should pay for content is a philosophical proposition. And philosophy doesn't butter your toast, frankly. And the reality is that experience, including our experience at the Irish Times, has been that it's a very small, for a variety of reasons, currently, it's a very small subset of your online audience who are prepared to go so far as to make a purchase decision for content. That may change, though. It is a fluid environment.
Yeah, all the experience seems to be, though, that people will not pay if they don't have to pay. And if you have that dynamic going on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have all of these huge corporates with obscene amounts of money available to them, and that they can manage to play this holding game to try and dominate the internet, it makes it incredibly difficult for small or medium organisations, to survive in that world?
Well, I mean, nobody said it was easy. Yes. No. I mean, I don't want to be. It's extremely serious. Lots of us, or when I say us, I mean media organisations, we look to some of these companies as possibly providing a way forward for us, which wasn't there previously. So, our Kindle product is growing in size, and that's through Amazon. Our e-paper application for iPad goes through the Apple gateway to some extent, although not entirely. There's a pull and push that goes on with these people about what's their cut, which is not unimportant. It's one thing for a newsagent who has to pay for his electricity and his staff and his rent and so on and so forth to take, let's say, 30% of the price of an individual copy of the Irish Times. It's another thing for Apple, and that's what they take, is 30%. That's a pretty high margin. And equally importantly, I think what they're more interested in, Apple, is not even so much their paltry 30% of Irish Times sales. It's the knowledge which they hold about our customers, and that's really important.
And on that note, I mean, I think another, if what we've talked about already isn't complicated enough, sort of another interesting line of thinking that we all know is coming, but Eric Jackson, in a recent article in Forbes, talked about the idea that Web 3.0 is never going to happen because clearly social is the dominant force on the web at the moment, and Facebook is the dominant company.
But you wouldn't want to have bought shares last week.
You wouldn't want to have bought shares last week, and at $1 billion per percentage point. I mean, the numbers are just absolutely astronomical. But equally, as we know, in the first quarter of this year, Facebook's revenues were down on the previous quarter, and that's why the share price is suffering at the moment. And the reason for that is because about 50% of all browsers are now mobile browsers. So obviously the Apple in particular, but smartphones and the iPad in particular are actually killing what we know as the traditional internet.
Yes, and that's one of the things that's hugely exciting about this, is it keeps changing all the time. You wait 6 months and another train comes along and runs over everything you thought you knew. You knew 6 months ago, if I didn't have to pay a mortgage, it would just be great. But I think the thing with the specific point about Facebook is that they took I think because their strategy was based so much on rapid audience growth over the last 5 years or so, was they took their eye off mobile. And in fact, if you look at their mobile applications, they're really not very impressive compared to some of their other things. So they lost some opportunities there. Yeah. Whether they managed to get them back is another matter. The broader question about the transfer to mobile, I think, is incredibly interesting. That is not just the new frontier, because clearly we've all crossed that frontier. I'd say there's barely a person in this room who doesn't have what is essentially a high-powered computer in their pocket, with which they can consume all kinds of content and do all kinds of interesting interactive things. That really changes so many things. And really, this is not just about media, and it's not just about newspapers. It's about everything. It's about writing novels. It's about selling cars. It's about getting jobs as a gardener. It's about everything. It fundamentally changes the building blocks of the way we order our society.
And people don't necessarily reflect on that. I mean, I think it's accepted by a lot of people that Google and Facebook are the two dominant forces. But of course, Google was the dominant force of Web 2.0.
Indeed.
It has struggled desperately to find a place in social. I mean, Google Plus has been a failure.
Yes.
I don't know if we're allowed to say that, but
yes, I think we can say that.
We can say that. And now we're saying so Facebook recently floated on the stock exchange worth whatever, 116 billion US dollars, and it's down to a mere 80 billion today, or whatever it is. But that's quite quick. I mean, in the period of 2 weeks. And again, it's because the same dynamic is happening, but it's happening at an accelerated pace.
Yes.
So therefore, Facebook is potentially facing extinction. I suppose that's Eric Jackson's view. Is that a...
Well, I think that, the history of the internet over the last 20 years, shows us that nothing is forever. And that one of the things that characterizes this phase of human development, or whatever you may want to call it, is that, and I think people have done some work on this in the States, is that the life cycle of great companies has become an awful lot shorter.
Sure.
And we're familiar with that with examples like Yahoo in the internet world and various other things, just being shadows of their former selves, AOL and so on and so forth. So it stands to reason that similar things will happen with the Facebooks of this world. I'm equally interested by something like Twitter, which is a huge social and cultural influence globally, but doesn't make money. Where does that go ultimately in the end? There was an expectation that Facebook would be a huge cash cow in some way, because it appeared to have a clear revenue stream business plan on the basis of advertising. But then you hear now at very large companies in the United States pulling their Facebook advertising because they reckon that it's not actually having any impact. And there is some interesting things to look at in terms of how does doing business, doing advertising, making transactions work, how do those work online? And maybe that doesn't work for Facebook. Well, maybe there is no business model underlying Facebook.
Huge question, certainly in our end of the industry and your end of the industry. But just to underline that point, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, in a recent interview, gave the following stats. He said that there was 67 million iPads sold in the first 2 years, and that's accelerating. The sale of them is accelerating. It took 24 years to sell as many Macs. It took 5 years to sell as many iPods. And it took 3 years to sell as many iPhones. I mean, it's just phenomenal penetration. But yet, Apple is a product company. It's not an internet company in the way that Facebook is or the way that Google is.
Sure.
So that's
it's a hardware company.
It's a hardware company.
That's where its profits are from.
So how do you see that playing out, Hugh?
The genius of it, the genius of Steve Jobs and I presume Tim Cook and a number of other people there, is that they managed to make these devices, and I see Apple laptops and things around here as well, just so much more attractive to the consumer than their rival competitors, and that's still the case. How did they manage to do that? Well, one of the things that's a bit heartening, I suppose, about the Apple history of the last few years is that things which perhaps were thought to be of declining importance proved still to be really bloody important. Good industrial design, is extremely important, both in terms of the tactile feel of the physical object itself and the way in which it proposes its interaction with you. The whole invention of the touch screen and the way that works is absolutely genius. I have a slight bee in my bonnet about Apple because I think they've gone off the boil design-wise in terms of their software over the last few years, but that's another matter. I suppose you could say that if you looked at those big giants, Amazon is rooted in being a retailer of content. Apple is rooted in being a seller of hardware. Facebook is rooted in social. Are Microsoft still a big giant anymore? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that's one way to look at it. I suppose another way to look at it is that Microsoft defined Web 1.0. They defined the desktop era. So if you look at it in a linear way as well, then Google defined Web 2.0, and search became the dominant thing. Then Facebook, we'll come back to Twitter in a couple of moments, and maybe we'll go over to Twitter in a couple of moments, are the dominant force in the current wave, which is the social wave, which is the dominant force at the moment, and very challenging for a lot of people because everyone is trying to design their social strategy, but they're trying to define their social strategy, which is being structured by Facebook.
Yes.
But now Apple has come all the way back again with those phenomenal growth figures, and as you say, it's a things company. It's not an internet company. So you end up with this very, very eclectic place, to put it mildly. That's none of us are quite sure what's going to happen in there.
But I mean, I love my job in the Irish Times and I love living in Dublin, but if I knew the answers to the implicit questions there, I'd be sitting in an enormous mansion somewhere in Palo Alto or somewhere, and I'd be looking out as I surveyed the world lying at my feet, wouldn't I? Well, because, I mean, things like, you know, Steve Jobs didn't want to have an app store. He didn't want to have apps when they launched the iPhone, you know, so, you know, he didn't know what he was doing.
Well, let's go back to newspapers then, and then maybe we'll go over to some Twitter questions. But I think an interesting point for me is that there was almost a vested interest in the Google phase, and certainly the early Facebook phase, to say that newspapers were dead and newspapers were old and newspapers didn't matter, and you know, and we all lived in whatever world we live in. But that isn't reflected by the current numbers. We were talking earlier about, certainly in the States, that the latest Audit Bureau of Circulation numbers, when they're including online circulation, show that newspaper circulation is actually going up, not going down.
Well, what's happening, I mean, there are a number of interesting things happening. The circulation figures are now, for the first time, integrating online subscription. In other words, people who pay to access content, be it the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, or the large number of other newspapers who have gone behind some form of a metered paywall or have announced their intention to do so. So that has an impact on the figures. You could argue the toss about how, you know, whether that type of a digital subscription is exactly equivalent, how much do people pay for it, and so on and so forth, and there's a lot of complexity behind those numbers. But I'd go to something more basic, actually, which is from the perspective of the Irish Times. More people read the Irish Times now than ever did in its history.
Absolutely.
Now, there are serious challenges with the business model and how you, dread word, monetize those users in some ways. But the fact is that in terms of our mission, as defined in the Articles of Association mentioned earlier, we're getting our mission out to a broader audience, and a huge audience outside Ireland, for example, that we never did before. So that is unequivocally a very good thing. The problem of reaching out to an audience is not a problem for any of us. We are probably more influential than we ever were before, and people who talk about us as being, you know, stale and old and dead would have trouble reconciling that with the actual numbers of people who come to us for one reason or another. But we still have the problem of turning those numbers into something sustainable, so we can go forward and continue doing what we do.
And again, maybe we'll come back to that. But I mean, so I suppose a huge challenge at the moment, therefore, is a common way of recording what is you know, circulation and readership, and display advertising, which was the thing that was sold on the back of that. It just doesn't compute anymore.
Well, I suppose one of the things is as well that, you know, newspapers are very different in different countries. So we always tend to look towards America, and for good reason, because it's very often the harbinger of the future before we know that it's the future. But the American newspaper industry is very different from the Irish and English newspaper industry, which in turn are very different from the European newspaper industry. And in the United States, they were even more dependent on advertising and really not so dependent on paying for content. They had very low prices for their newspapers, and all that model has shifted enormously. Plus, in America and in Europe, most people subscribe to newspapers as opposed to going into a shop on a daily basis and buying them, and that changes very much the dynamic of your business in terms of paying for content. But people do tend to focus, to my view, almost too much on the paying for content end of things. The reality is that for most newspapers, other forms of revenue always formed the majority of their revenue, and those are the ones that are actually even more under threat than circulation. In terms of looking at what the numbers are, we would look at our paid subscriptions, which currently are to two products which I mentioned earlier, and we'd also obviously look at analytics, and we look at those not just every week or every month. We look at them every day and every hour, and we now have a big screen up above our news desk telling us what's trending up and what's trending down. It can be kind of horrifying sometimes, to be honest. And it doesn't mean that all our decisions are informed by that alone, but it's very useful information, and we use it to inform.
And that's just going to have to become a common language. I mean,
yeah, I think, and it can be quite arcane. You know, people talk about unique users, or people talk about number of visits. They talk about whether it's daily or monthly. People talk about page impressions. I mean, we were talking earlier about numbers of, excuse me, we were talking earlier about numbers about unique users. Now, I, in my own right, am 6 different unique users between the phone in my pocket and the iPad there, and the laptop at home, and the desktop at home, and the desktop in the office, and something else that might have been looking at. You know, so those uniques numbers are pretty kind of meaningless. But even digging into that even further, it seems to me that what's most important to us as newspapers is loyalty and engagement, and a relationship with what may be a much smaller number of individuals than these huge numbers. 10,000 people came to us this month, 15,000 people read the Daily Mail every day, fine. But what you're really interested in is the subset, which is maybe 150,000 people, 160,000 people, who see us as their prime source of trusted news, and for that reason come to us every day. They're the people who are of value to us in terms of fulfilling our mission in the Articles of Association, and frankly, they're also the people who we can make a viable business out of into the future.
I mean, trying to sum that up for the Irish Times, then. I mean, there seems to me that there's 4 sort of key pillars at the moment in the strategy for the overall Irish Times, and the first 2 relate to what I think you've just been talking about. Although Irish Times people are very self-conscious. You've already rebutted me a bit when I tried to talk about core values and about the, because I and I can understand that, but I do think
a very well-known Irish independent journalist said to me sometimes, what is this thing about the Irish Times, Hugh? What is it? Somebody said to me, he's not very Irish Times. What is that? And I said, see, if I have to ask, well then,
Yeah, sure. But I mean, it does seem that there's, in the first instance, there is an incredible focus on the core values about what the newspaper, or whatever term we should use now, is about, and therefore utter clarity about its role within society, and society being a growing thing at the moment. And then a point of view about that, a point of view that you've just been talking about in a world of white noise, as Kevin explains, that people do need insight that they can trust, which is, I think, what you've been talking about. So those first 2 pieces, the core values piece, and then that role of insight and trust, do seem to be very, very, very embedded in the Irish Times. And although I absolutely accept it's unfair to refer to other media organisations, but it's very, very apposite at the moment that a lot of media organisations in Ireland, when the pressure has come on, have found it very, very difficult to be substantive in that space. And not just in, I mean, when you listen to the Levis inquiry every night, fundamentally it is about an absence of those 2 things, which to me seem to be absolutely present in the Irish Times. And then on top of that, I'm
immediately starting to feel a but. There has to be a but here.
No. I'm trying to sum it up for myself. Is that is if I was talking to, I was chatting to Kevin and say, Kevin, is this about the Irish Times? But the third piece is currently a commitment to, I suppose, the social web in particular. And to participating on the social web and making the content available in the social web. And then I suppose that's the 4th piece, bringing in the new content management system and responding to digital developments as they happen, to make sure that you can respond to the social web and those issues. So they seem to be 4 key cornerstones. Is that fair?
I think so. And in relation to the one you mentioned about the social web, we advertised only last week for what is an entirely new position conceptually within the editorial team of the Irish Times, which is the position of communities editor, which is a overview of everything that we do in social media, plus dealing with what's called user-generated content on our site, which we hope to have more and more of, and essentially will have responsibility, this person, for managing that entirely new 2-way relationship that takes place between our readers and our journalists. Now, that's not to say that there are very traditional ways in which the readers and the journalists have communicated. The Irish Times letters page is a great institution. The letters to the editor is a fantastic institution. It's a barometer of what our readers think about what we're doing. But there is a whole, as you know, real-time set of conversations happening now about the events we cover and the opinions we express and the analysis we provide, which can be a huge challenge for journalists who, frankly, are under huge pressure because we are under financial pressure, and like all media organisations, we've had cutbacks in the last while, and everybody is working harder than they ever did before. And now you're saying, and you'll also have to do this, and we are also going to need to do that. But that is the reality of the world in which we now work. And also, it can be incredibly stimulating to move from that monologue to a dialogue relationship.
Sure.
But
in terms of the beyond the fog type of idea, that there seems to be a cohesiveness or a strategic cohesiveness in those pillars around values, a point of view, engaging in social, and using the technology as it comes forward. And I mean, that is a strategy that I think of most people in the media and media-related industries like ours, in the advertising industry, and certainly advertisers were to follow, that there is the bones of a very clear strategic approach in that.
Well, we have a relatively new editor, and we have a relatively new managing director, Liam Kavanagh, and they've worked together to devise this strategy. And I think journalists can be creatures of habit a lot of the time, and they don't necessarily always react well to change. But I think there's very strong buy-in by people in the Irish Times.
And then, of course, two huge unknowns that we agree, or even we can't even really go there. One, what is a mobile internet going to look like?
Sure.
We just don't know. It's happening. And secondly, is the business model and the payment systems. And again, it's emerging, but depending on who wins in the internet wars and what particular walled gardens have got to play in, that could change.
Yeah, and all we can do is try small things and watch what's happening in the broader world. So newspapers have looked with great interest at the New York Times experiment, but we do need to be conscious that the New York Times is a massive global media organization. The only comparable one I can think of really is the BBC, and therefore is not comparable with smaller media organizations in small countries. It's particularly in fiercely competitive markets as we are, where people can source, basic news services from 7 or 8 people at the flick of a switch.
Sure. Before we hand over, before we invite people in, just one last question. If you go back to the sort of cultural and artistic roots of the community you came from, and the people that you had a healthy respect for in those days, how have their lives been both enriched and challenged by what's happening at the moment in digital information technology?
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because people tend to segment this into a generational phenomenon to some extent, but I know people who are in their 60s who are incredibly across new technology, and people in their 30s who aren't at all. Have people's lives been enriched by? I think everybody's life is enriched by the digital technology as much as they let it be. I suppose what I mean by this is an Irish Times columnist wrote, I know you'll find this hard to believe, but a rather ill-informed article a few months ago, which was about the evils of Twitter. And this columnist in particular had been advised by his sons that he should get on Twitter to follow the many players from Liverpool Football Club who were on Twitter and had many interesting things to say, apparently. So he wrote this column about how, in fact, they hadn't had very many interesting things to say. In fact, they had nothing interesting to say. In fact, Twitter was full of nothing but rubbish spouted by idiots. Now, I'm an Everton fan, so I could have told him that anyway.
Sure.
But what he misunderstood was he was confusing the tool with the content. It's like, you can use a telephone to save somebody's life, or you can use a telephone to get somebody killed. It's still just a telephone, and it's what you do with it that counts. And I think that goes to the core of what the Irish Times is about, and no matter whether people are consuming content or creating content, or, as is increasingly the case, doing both almost simultaneously, I think that's still true.
Sure. I believe that we're at another fascinating time, and what's really important now are people of substance, people who can think strategically, people with a value system, and people who have a point of view about what they're trying to do. And Hugh is incredibly modest. He doesn't allow me lay those ideas on him. But I think we'd all agree that Hugh is as close an example of the real next innovation that is coming. And I think what's happening in the Irish Times, hugely impacted by Hugh's leadership, which I think we've all heard here tonight, and we can understand where some of that emerging thinking is coming from, or where the thinking, it's more than emergent thinking, it's quite substantive and structured thinking. So it was fantastic, and thank you for giving us such a wonderful insight into that, and a great education. I think we all know a lot more about what's happening now than we did an hour ago. So Hugh, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.